Final Fantasy Mystic Quest is a turn-based JRPG developed and published by Square for the SNES. Released as Mystic Quest Legend in PAL regions and Final Fantasy USA Mystic Quest in Japan, the game is a spin-off to the popular Final Fantasy series. Released between Final Fantasies IV and V, Mystic Quest was marketed as a simplified role-playing game designed for the entry-level player. The game follows the story of Benjamin, a youth from an unnamed village destroyed just as the player presses the New Game button, who has been set upon a journey to save the 4 crystals that sustain the world from the monsters that have cast shadows upon them. Along the way, he meets friends who teach him, as well as the player, how to be an effective hero by using magic, weapons, items, basic puzzle solving, and platforming. In much the same manner as other entries in the series, the player controls the main character through top-down environments and, when coming into contact with the monster, transitioning to a turn-based battle screen where commands are entered before each round begins and the consequences of your inputs play out. Character growth and equipment acquisition are linear, with each level giving a set amount of stats gained. There are only 4 types of equipment with 3 tiers each. Magic is similarly simple with 3 categories of 4 spells each, most all of which are found in easy-to-find treasure chests sprinkled throughout the game. The customization one might come to expect from nearly every other title in the series is nowhere to be found here, and this is done so on purpose. Though the game was developed by a Japanese team, it was specifically made for American markets, and was thus released first in the States, at a time when console RPGs were not widely known or played. The developers attributed this to the perceived difficulty of the genre, and sought to create a game meant to be a primer. Evidence of this perception can also be found in the US release of Final Fantasy IV, released originally in the States as Final Fantasy II, where aspects of the game were simplified in an effort to make it easier overall. Though the reception of the game was not great, fans and publications have consistently praised the game's heavily rock-influenced soundtrack, as composed by Ryuji Sasai and Yasuhiro Kawakami. The final boss theme remains one of the most downloaded songs on the DS game Theatrhythm Final Fantasy. Ultimately, the game failed to accomplish its goal of bringing a new generation into RPGs, and simultaneously alienated gamers who were already fans by not appealing to the challenge they desired. Thoughts?
Well, it is unfortunate, that they didn't pull the audience they were looking for with this game, because I said it several times throughout playing the game. I love it. It's such a simple, just pick up and go game. I love the music. I love how silly the characters and the dialogue are. It's one of those things like 1988's Bloodsport starring Jean-Claude Van Damme. It may not be good, but I love it.
It's a guilty pleasure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No,
but I don't even feel that guilty about it, though. I think the game has a lot of merits that, and maybe this is because I played it, well, no, I played it at the time, but I was still like 8 or 9. But
yeah, no, and you and I do agree on this. I think we both have thought of this game very fondly. For me, this was one of those games that I played over the course of 2 or 3 snow days.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, and it was the perfect game to knock through that, and I was at the right age range where it wasn't a challenge, but I was also very responsive to the feeling of succeeding in an RPG.
Sure.
The first 2 RPGs that I got a chance to really grind through on my own were Final Fantasy II US and Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. And having had the chance to play through and beat both of those games, it's a tremendous training tool for an 8 or 9-year-old to get good
definitely.
at playing RPGs. So in that sense, I absolutely do love it. I totally understand where older gamers are coming from with that lack of depth.
Sure.
But, I mean...
especially from a game like Final Fantasy, because Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3, none of those are easy games.
Right.
By any stretch of the imagination. They suffer from a lot of the limitations of the medium at the time, where things are hard just because there weren't more creative ways to come up with a difficulty spike. So you just get these vast changes in difficulty in the game, And if you play the first Final Fantasy, you know what I'm talking about when you get to the Earth Cave, and then again later the Ice Cave.
Oh, sure.
Both of these will just, if you're not ready for them, they'll just ruin your life entirely.
I owned Final Fantasy 1 for the NES as a kid. I did not beat Final Fantasy 1 until I revisited it years later, as a teenager.
Yeah.
And it was because that game was not really at a difficulty level that a kid was going to be able to get through it.
Sure. And yeah, maybe that was the problem they made, or the problem with their perception is it wasn't like grown adults playing these games. It was kids.
Sure.
Maybe difficulty was a part of the why they weren't big, or maybe it was just because the people who wanted to play our games couldn't buy them with their lunch money.
I mean, that's definitely part of it. I mean, Dragon Quest became famous for that. I mean, there are stories about kids skipping school in Japan to go buy the latest Dragon Quest game, and that became like a huge problem at one point.
That's awesome.
Like that series had gotten to that level. We didn't have that here in the States, honestly, until FF7 was the first Final Fantasy game that put that many people into the series.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't obviously the initial sales of that. It was as people figured out what it was and then started buying it in droves.
Sure. See, it actually worked retrograde for me, because when Final Fantasy VII came out, I was right at the time when I got a PlayStation that was probably 7 or 8 years old. And I got Final Fantasy VII, and I was like, I remember seeing other games with this title, but different numbers at Blockbuster. I should go try those. And from there, I played Final Fantasy II US and then Final Fantasy Mystic Quest.
Yeah.
And I actually beat those before I beat 7. I was not... The first time I played Final Fantasy 7, I got all the way to the end, to the final boss, and I couldn't beat him. So I'm just like, I did something wrong here. I'm starting the game over.
Well, you remember over at MagFest, the Saturday talk we had on games literacy?
Yeah.
And one of the people at our table said, like, I think it was Chris's anecdote, I don't remember for sure, he said, the Final Fantasy you remember the most fondly is the one you beat when you're 12.
Yeah.
And I think, to his point, there's a certain, like, when you are simultaneously skilled enough to get through something and mentally aware enough to take kind of the thematic elements of that game with you, that's that point where it clicks. And if you don't have the skill to get through the game and you can't get through those earlier Final Fantasies, then the depth of the story is lost to you.
Yeah.
And it's nice that, especially like a lot of the later entries, by the time people were getting to those, they had the skills necessary to access and get through them. But yeah, a lot of those early Final Fantasy games, 1, 2, and 3 for the Famicom especially, suffer from the RPG people are going to be able to get through this.
Yes.
Other people need not apply.
Yeah. Although, I mean, there's a case to be made, too, with Final Fantasy 1 and 2, especially that, to Japan, that, if you were good at Dungeons and Dragons, you could have gotten through those games,
for sure.
Because the spell system was completely ripped off on D&D.
They drew so heavily from TSR in the early entry. I mean, the enemies like the Beholder and the Wizard and the Mind Flayer, and
cockatrices,
all of it's a straight D&D essentially recreation.
I mean, the bosses, like the 4 main bosses, were a Lich, a Merilith, a Kraken, and a Dragon.
Yeah,
Where have I seen those before?
Yeah, I mean, straight names out of the book and everything, right?
Yeah.
But in the case of Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, you finally had a game that was designed to deal with the fact that, we should probably make a Final Fantasy game that Western audiences it's accessible for them.
Mm-hmm.
And through the benefit of hindsight, those of us who have this wide array of great RPGs to play now, you'd kind of laugh looking back at Mystic Quest, especially mechanically.
Oh, yeah.
But for presentation purposes, I mean, obviously we both gush over the soundtrack.
Oh, of course.
But for
so does everyone, apparently.
Yeah, for a lot of reasons, I think this is one of like 2 or 3 games that I would seriously consider if someone asked me, like, I want to play an RPG, but I've never played one before.
Oh, yeah.
This is one of the first games that comes to mind. It's like, try this, because if you like it, if you're willing to sit through the fights to get experience and see your character get stronger and not worry about the minutia of the menus and be okay with kind of this campy 4 gems, like Pillars of Light, blah, 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 like trope RPG story.
Mm-hmm.
If you're cool with it, then great. This is a sign that we have 100 other things to recommend to you. But even if you don't, it's a fairly condensed experience. You saw, I mean, it didn't take us forever to get through this.
Sure.
But you'll know after a while whether or not this type of game is for you, and it's a good way to figure that out.
Sure. I think I was a part of like the critical initial reception. It was like I was saying before about how the people buying it or the people wanting it were kids.
Mm-hmm.
And kids weren't, at the time, weren't necessarily a very trackable demographic. I mean, we were only able to ever do what our parents allowed us to do, or if we had allowance, we could go out and buy these games. But like, it's not like we could jump online and send a letter to
Sure.
to Square and be like, hey, I love this game so much, you should do more like these things. Thank you. Or, the only people who could have been heard were the adults or the teenagers who were playing it, and was like, well, this is a straight downgrade from the
Yeah.
previous game.
It's
Why would I like this?
it's something we take for granted, I think, a lot. But the World Wide Web was at its absolute infancy at the height of the Super Nintendo's powers.
Yeah.
And it was the next generation of consoles that were really the first generation that were discussed and communicated and shared online.
I don't think GameFAQs got any traffic until the PlayStation landed.
Right.
Like once the new Mega Mans, the new Final Fantasies came on there, all the different RPGs that the PS1 had, and then simultaneously the N64, all the secrets you could find in Banjo-Kazooie, all that kind of stuff. That was where like gaming websites really started to kind of hit, because otherwise it was just
It was the early wave of PS1, to a lesser extent, after the fact, with like Dreamcast had its niche audience and Saturn had its niche audience. Early PC gaming, like you had the Diablo clans everywhere, but it was kind of like the first real major online communities for gaming were kind of forming. They existed before, but they were not large enough communities to have like the kind of impact that affect a global view of these things. And so,
we had AOL chat rooms, and that was about it.
it's dark times.
Very, very dark times.
And speaking of dark times, Mystic Quest was the first Final Fantasy released in Europe.
Whoopsie! How'd we miss that one?
And in the case of the United States, I understand it, because they had been exposed to other games before, and then came back and said this was an entry-level game. If you are a kid in Europe and you've played a bunch of, like, you have a different perception of video games because you've kind of come from a different background on them. PC gaming in the 80s was the thing. I mean, the Commodore 64, Commodore Amiga, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, the PC enthusiast era in Europe was very strong for a long time. It was not... I mean, the NES was around, but it was not the juggernaut that it was in the US and Japan.
Sure.
And so, for the first exposure for that market to Final Fantasy to be Mystic Quest... I mean, you have to compare that to like what we experienced, where we had a few games and we had played FF1 and 2, and you had a general idea of what the series was about, and this was, this is the easy version of it.
Yeah.
You had some context to compare that against. In the case of Europe, like, they hit this first Final Fantasy game, it's like, what's this? You're kidding, right? This is Baby Town Frolics.
And they weren't wrong.
Yeah.
They really weren't. I would actually love to hear from like some of our friends across the sea here, across the ocean, and like people who had it at the time, whether you were a teenager or a kid. I really want to know what your thoughts were of the game when you first played it, if you can remember back that far, because it's 20 years old now, more than something like that. No, but that would just be something kind of cool to hear. It's just everyone else's general reception of it.
It's rolling up on its 25th anniversary.
Good gravy.
That would be next year, I believe.
Good grief.
So.
Final Fantasy 7 just hit its 20th, I think.
Yeah, 97 to...
Sounds right.
Or 96 to 2016.
Yeah.
About, yeah.
At least at the time of this recording. This probably won't take too long to get up here.
No.
But yeah, I guess it's like you said, because the PC gaming was the focus out there, but it still just blows my mind that they didn't get at least the first one. I get not getting the second and third one.
Right.
Because I don't even think we saw those until the Origins.
Yeah, it wasn't until
version.
we had compilation stuff coming down. Yeah, because
there was like a year where there was the Final Fantasy like Origins, which had 1 and 2, and then like Chronicle was 4 and Chrono Trigger, and then what was the last one? The one that Anthology had 5 and 6, which was the first time we saw 5.
Period, yeah.
And we didn't see 3, like a legit copy of 3 in America, until the DS version, I don't think. And even then it was kind of a different shade of the game entirely. Like, having played both, they're very different mechanically, because they wanted to go through and clean things up and make it friendly for the DS and make use some of those features in making the game. But it was a very different experience.
Yeah. So, staying on the idea of FFMQ as having a specific response and targeting the West specifically. The soundtrack to this game
Oh, baby.
is it's
I
metal,
mean-
it's intense, it's active, it's powerful,
Mm-hmm.
it's engaging. It's one of the system's best soundtracks.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, whether you like the game or not, I mean, listen to the Doom Castle theme and just try not to get hyped up for a dungeon.
But it sounds different enough from a lot of other RPG music
Yeah.
that I generally have I've put myself in this headspace where I'm wondering, was it done on purpose? Like, do you go more this way? Is this, society thinking I need to do something more metal because that's going to work better with the Western? Or is it I'm freed up to do this because this is for this audience?
Well, it's not as though the Japanese composers are afraid of putting rock in their games. Especially like look at a lot of the newer RPGs these days, and even some of like the Tales games.
Right.
Even the older ones, they would have had some more rock influenced music. Especially in like character specific battle themes.
Yeah.
A lot of those games would have a very like rock based battle theme for
The
Lloyd or
early
whatever.
NIS RPGs, the 3 Atelier Iris games, and then
Yeah.
like the 2 Mana Chemia games too.
Yeah.
Like real serious like heavy metal going on with like especially the boss fights.
Oh yeah. But also, I mean, even more recent examples. Look at Bravely Default. There's a lot
Oh,
of metal
definitely.
in the battle fights there.
For sure.
The battle fights. Way to go, Richard. So I don't necessarily think it was like that the Sasai and Kawakami did it like because they thought it would market. I think it was more that they were kind of able to do so at that point. If I had to choose between one of the two, I
Right.
think it was because like, well, here's a demographic that isn't necessarily set in the ways about how the music in an RPG is supposed to be. Like, I mean, these guys, if they think dungeon theme, they can think, the Gale Tower from Mystic Quest, not necessarily the Dark Cavern theme from Final Fantasy IV.
Yeah, it's as I dig through this and hunt, it looks like Ryuji is they call him a J-rocker. And
So then it's just the demographic that he likes to appeal to anyways.
yeah, a lot of these are older dead URLs, and I've been hunting, try to find some evidence of this, and if I can find it, I'll throw it up in the backdrop here. But it sounds like this is a sound that he pursues anyway, so it very well may be me. They like get the guy who thematically matches what we're looking for.
Yeah,
or,
absolutely.
This is the composer we brought on, and this is his style, like being invited heavily into it.
And hey, I'm glad he did. I don't know if they'd gotten anybody else, I don't know if it would have been quite the same experience for me, because it is a simple game, but just playing through it and listening to like the dungeon themes and everything like that, it does enhance the experience by quite a bit.
It carries the game at times
Oh, yeah.
because there are a couple dungeons. Doom Castle's a little long. Pazuzu's Tower is a little long. The Ice Pyramid is frankly a little long, and it's a lot of repetitive fights. Even the Bone Dungeon is a bit.
Yeah.
But the really good music helps kind of ameliorate some of the grindy feeling that some of those places have, because when you cut back into that music, it's that good. It's like the reward of going through the fight is you get to keep listening to the dungeon music.
Yeah.
And then the boss fight music is excellent, even though there's only the 2 themes for boss fights, but they're both good.
Well, there were 3 battle themes in the whole game, and all 3 of them were just top tier.
Right.
Like, the Dark King is still one of my favorite final bosses, music-wise, ever.
And so I think, yes, take away the soundtrack from this game.
It goes from like a 7 to about a 5.
Yeah,
or
it
4.
becomes it does become harder to defend this game.
Yeah, a lot harder.
But I think it's harder to defend it for us trying to say, hey, RPG fan, aficionado, interested, connoisseur type person, this is worth your time.
Sure.
I don't think it affects it too much from I want to use this to teach little Timmy how to play an RPG.
Yeah.
It's going to make the game far more forgettable for them, because I don't think without the music, I don't think you feel as fondly about the title.
I mean, if you're looking at it this way, it's like with the music, it's like you're learning through playing a game or a fun activity.
Yeah.
Without it, it's like doing homework.
Right. but it would still, boring as it might be a good way to train somebody on the RPG mechanics.
Definitely. So. And just a quick note, like as far as the sound goes, like the soundtrack's amazing. I also really like just the sound font they use for just all your little notifications, and like getting a treasure is a fun sound every time that you level up or whatever you every time you rest at the end.
Yeah,
it's just
the calisthenics.
Yeah, just stretching every morning after you wake up.
Yeah.
I actually really like all of just the little silly sound effects in the game. I think they fit the theme, they fit the game. They're not like grating or annoying.
Right.
You know what each one is. They're distinct. They're clear. They're very indicative of what's going on.
And combined with a lot of the sort of simple puzzle mechanics, the game has a very tangible feel to the sounds, like the bombs exploding and the jump spring, kind of the boing boing, you know,
and like the sword swinging.
Yeah,
the little swing it does.
So it gives those
the
effects,
axe like swinging and thunking into whatever you're hitting.
Oh yeah, like the mushrooms or the trees or whatever you're cutting down. And again, I think because those mechanically, and this will kind of segue here into some of the mechanics of the game, because that sound is so physical that you're getting kind of what you're doing, it helps make those map segments feel just a little more platformy.
Sure.
A little more accessible, because they are not complicated puzzles, but they're still map puzzles. Mm-hmm. And I think they're more easily understood and digested if you think of the characters, this is me running around and I have to solve this puzzle and hit the thing and move the switch, than as this character that I'm moving is an abstract representation of my party, and there's a thing I have to do here in the zone.
And it's kind of neat that when you look at it, as of especially with the platforming, it really felt like more of a primer to JRPGs and not just the Final Fantasy series, because the Final Fantasy series, to a point, didn't really have a whole lot of puzzle solving or platforming.
Very few.
Like Final Fantasy VII, I'm playing through it right now, and it amazes me that it's a walking simulator with random battles and boss fights and inventory management.
6 has very few moments where you're doing that. Like, scant few, and they tend to be for finding secrets.
Yeah, like the finding the chainsaw. That's definitely a puzzle that you have to solve. But there wasn't any platforming in that game.
No,
you don't jump anywhere. You don't hook across platforms.
Right.
You don't.
No timing windows to really worry about.
Yeah, you don't have to cut down trees with an axe to get from point A to B.
And generally in Square games going forward, that kind of stuff's been more minigame and less core gameplay.
Right. Whereas in Mystic Quest, you need the Dragon Claw to get from side A to side B. You need to cut down that tree. You have to stab the face on the wall with your sword to get it to open up.
And if memory serves, this was the Saga team.
Yes, I believe so.
And I think that's something worth stressing too. Is
they put the Final Fantasy title on it, but it was at heart kind of a Saga game.
And you can see that, like, visually when you go to those other titles and look at them, the similarities and like the combat.
The battle screen is just about exactly the same. Right. There's some sprite repurposing. Mm-hmm.
So it's obviously the core Final Fantasy games don't adopt so much from that, but it's not really Final. It's Final Fantasy by another name.
Sure.
So, mechanically, it's simplistic. Mm-hmm. But somehow, through its simplicity, there managed to be a lot of bugs.
Yeah, and I don't think I've come across a Final Fantasy game before, like 8 or 9, that didn't have some sort of bug.
Right.
Like with a 6, it was Magic Evade, or Evade. They did the same thing.
Yeah.
7, Magic Defense on equipment didn't work.
Right. It amazes me that this series has been plagued with, for as rich and complex and beautiful, and as much as we heap praise on a lot of Final Fantasy games, simple core mechanical things like Magic Defense not defending you against magic, or Evade not doing anything, or Magic Evade not doing anything but regular Evade counting for both.
Yeah.
Like, things like that seem to slip through the cracks. And a lot of them in here, given the sheer simplicity of this game, amaze me.
I know you love the life spell.
My incredulity about the life spell is completely and totally valid.
Did you look this up? Was it a bug?
It's the problem is it's counting every enemy as undead.
Is that what that is?
For purposes of the casting thing.
So it's only supposed to do that on undead monsters.
Right. And it's working on all of them. So I feel somewhat validated in my protest of that. I'm still a little bit salty that the life spell also heals you to full if you're not dead. It essentially functions as like a life 2/cure 4 spell.
Yeah, slash like an antidote or whatever.
Yeah. And since it's
remedy.
the same cost as, because it's life as a category, or it's white magic as a category for X charges.
Yeah, you have like 40 of those by the end of the game.
Your decision goes away. And I feel like if you're using this game to teach basic RPG things, you want cure to heal, life to bring back from the dead, and heal to restore status effects. Because that's what you're trying to teach that paradigm.
Yeah.
And if life does everything, that paradigm kind of falls through the cracks.
And it will do that. All of those things do accomplish that goal.
Right.
You just have to not know how to break the game.
Yeah.
So little 6-year-old Timmy wouldn't think to use the life spell.
As soon as he accidentally does, or as soon as he
Mommy, what the F?
That's getting the system taken away. But then, little things like the double level trick, whatever, I can see how that might have been missed.
Sure,
and
one seems reasonable to me.
That's hardly a game-breaking thing.
Because even playtesting, you would have had to plan for that to happen to even find it.
The reset for support characters and their like immunities and stats and stuff.
I feel like other games have had a similar bug to that, but I know something else did, but it's not coming to mind.
That one really irks me though, because that one's going to trip people up, and that requires a little bit of a coder's mind. You kind of have to understand how like memory works, and that so the problem is that even though we have a new character loaded into memory, like their stats have not been pushed to other pointers that are being used by the combat system to recognize and pick stuff, and for some reason they only coded that to happen when you load the save as opposed to like reading from those values directly, which may have been done as some form of memory protection, because maybe when they were reading from those there was a risk of writing or changing them, and there was worry that they were going to like corrupt those character files, so they had to keep them independent of whatever. Like I don't know what they were doing in assembly behind the scenes to make the game work the way it did, but
of the major bugs that we found in the game, like that was the only one I thought was annoying, because it forces you to put a break in your gameplay to stop, reset it, soft reset or hard reset even.
Yeah.
And then reload and then get back to whatever you're doing. And the SNES, it doesn't take that long to restart anything. It's not a new system. It's on a computer. It doesn't take 30
reach
seconds.
over and hit it.
Yeah, you reach over, you hit it, you press 3 buttons 5 seconds later, and you're back in the game. But it's still just a kind of a jarring stop and go in your gameplay if you want your characters to be effective.
And again, there's a certain trust factor there, so most players aren't going to figure it out or understand that that's happening, so you're just assuming that things are going well. And since
they might not even notice if they have to stop in the middle of it. If it's dinner time, they turn it off. They won't even notice.
Yeah, since the game's not super challenging, it's easy to go through and not notice that those things are being switched up along the way. But it would have been nice to see those function correctly.
Yeah.
If, again, for no other reason, then it starts to invite players to look strategically and go like, oh, Kaylee is strong against stone. That's awesome. So that's why when the boss casts this stone thing, it freezes me, but it doesn't freeze her.
Yeah.
There are a few other minor things here and there, but I don't think I've got anything else from a mechanical thing that I really want to kind of twist the knife on.
Just Cure being the strongest attack spell in the final boss, but that's about it.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of hit a boiling point with goofy mechanical nonsense.
Right. I'm not even sure how that one works, because it only works on the final boss, and it only does that when Benjamin casts it. So I have no idea how that happened.
Honestly, that strikes me as debugging that didn't get taken out.
Okay.
Like,
I need to wait just to kill this boss real quick.
Right. If they are scripting and testing the ending, and you go through the ending, so you have a save right before the ending, and you keep testing the ending over and over and again to like tweak the ending to get something right.
Sure.
And so you just want to be able to plow through the final boss to test and do whatever for the ending. I can totally envision a scenario where you would hide this one little way to quick kill the boss, and then forget to take it out.
Whoopsie.
Or it could very well be we felt that for entry-level players, Dark King was going to be too hard, and if they got frustrated on it, then maybe they could go look for, like, how do I beat Dark King, or call the tip line, or whatever you would do at that point. And it would be like, have you tried Cure?
Despite the game's apparent and inherent simplicity, some of the bosses are just unfair.
Well, yeah, and that boils down to an issue of end trials. So you only have 2 characters.
Yeah. And that's probably, I think, is the
And
biggest swing.
the decision for who goes first and last is a narrow enough decision often enough that it's possible for the boss to get the last action in a turn and the first action in the following turn.
Yeah.
And if he uses a status effect on character A at the end and character B at the start, there is 100% absolutely nothing you can do about it, and you lose the fight.
Yeah, which I guess is why they put the give up yes no screen in there, so you don't have to like spend a whole lot of time running back through the dungeon to get back there.
There are ways to get around that. Most games have got around that by this concept of cooldowns. That a boss has certain abilities that are considered dangerous, and thus we put a restraint on how often or what frequency a boss does something. So if a boss has like a petrify ability,
Sure,
we would say he can only use that at minimum every 3rd or 4th action, because that guarantees that scenario here, that hard lock, from occurring. For a game like Mystic Quest, that's probably asking to bite off a bit more of the code than they were ready to do, because I'm sure they just had a simple table or map of abilities, and either the randomizer or the clock is determining what gets called and when.
Yeah.
Because with a lot of these assembly-based things, like the language is to make this happen is pretty complicated stuff. It wasn't really until the PlayStation era games when we opened up to other object languages, and the writing this code actually became a ton easier. Like, one of the reasons we had so many amazing PlayStation games is the difficulty in the making of the game. That was one of the first major drops in that difficulty.
Yeah.
We went from, at one point we went from building things with electrical engineering to, now we can put in microprocessors. That was a huge jump. Then with like the microprocessor assembly stuff, like we had an era of that. And then it was moving to object-oriented languages, and like all of a sudden we were using dev kits and making games in C and C++, and that was a huge leap. And it's kind of been like stages, and then the next big stage was when we got into like engine development, and we started making games with proprietary engines or open engines, and it's like we've had stages in game development, and this game takes place in that kind of like assembly era game development. So there's actually a lot to making the AI different, and if you only have so much time invested in building this stuff, it's like, do we really want to burn another month of development time to effectively modify the way enemies behave to work on a more complicated like level of whatever?
Well, hell no, Christmas is next month. We can't do that.
Yeah, and that's that's the eternal question, is development time and schedules and what you can get and what you can't get in. But it is unfortunate that you do have the like sort of the frustrating, we hit it a couple times, but it wasn't too bad. Just one of those, like, there's nothing you can do about it. You die, start over. So you absolutely want that give up yes no function in here.
Yeah, especially if you don't have the time or the resource to program in the way that becomes unnecessary.
Right. You could, in theory, get around this a little bit with you can save anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So if players learn after like a first difficult fight that they need to be using that save anywhere thing, then they're saving before their hard fight, doing it, and then whatever. But if you had regular enemies who had the ability to do stone, well, all of a sudden now every single one of those regular fights is a potential hard death, go back to your previous save point. And in most RPGs, you are generally comfortable in the random encounters that you're not going to get kicked back to your last save. Generally.
Until you play Final Fantasy IV DS, when everything can kill you.
Yeah. Well, that was using the original difficulty curve and not the Final Fantasy II.
Oh, it was even harder than the original difficulty curve. It was insanely hard.
But
on purpose.
You don't want an entry-level game like Mystic Quest that's going to go and pin on you this, like, every single fight you engage in is a chance to have to repeat 20 minutes of the game.
Well, yeah. Although from Fireberg on, enemies do start getting petrify and paralysis and sleep and confused and all these really nasty side effects.
Which is another reason I'm totally comfortable and okay with them having give up, yes, no.
Yeah.
Like, that, I'm 100% behind that.
I mean, one thing that would remove the need for that window is a third character as well.
True. Again, because then your hard lock thing is gone, and you are then free to whatever. But the fact that I believe they start your second character on auto, and you have to put them on manual.
Yeah.
So you really are at the base of this game just controlling Benjamin.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that a third character would have been necessary. I feel like the game works well enough with two, and generally I don't feel that way about games. But this game is so Benjamin-centric
Yeah.
that it doesn't really bother me so much. I'm still very anti-Tristan.
Really?
Oh, yeah, totally. He's selfish, he's self-centered, he's off searching for stuff, he grabs Spencer away from you, and just all sorts of...
He gives you the sweet-ass dragon claw, though.
Eventually.
He charges you $10,000 for medicine.
Yeah, thanks, buddy.
Didn't I make a Skrelly joke when he...
I
I'm pretty sure I did.
So... Oh, another point I want to bring up.
What's up?
Battlegrounds.
Okay. Alright. Okay.
So
my thing with Battlegrounds is... I think Battlegrounds are a good idea, but not as your only source of open world random encounters.
Right.
Because I think that's kind of what they were trying to emulate, and I think I mentioned this in one of the videos as well. They were trying to emulate the open world random encounter thing with Battlegrounds, but I don't think they work as effectively that way because you can just walk right over them. They don't matter. They're not random encounters. They become side quests.
Right. And you have to drill through all 10 fights to get the goodie.
Yeah.
There are a lot of those Battlegrounds for which I feel like a zone similar to the bridge zone, where you just had 10 or 12 enemies in a zone and one red chest somewhere in that zone.
It would have served the purpose just as well, if not better.
It's just as well, if not better. Because if you are struggling for experience, you could always go back to the battleground you were comfortable, or the mid zone you were comfortable at.
Yeah.
And if you were, good with that, you could just walk over it anyway.
I mean, Battlegrounds are basically just any game you play that has like a fighting arena, like side quest thing you do. That's all a Battleground is.
Sure.
They just put it in your way so that you see it and that you have a what's the word I'm looking for? An incentive to do it.
Right. But most games have one at most two places like that.
Right. Whereas this one had 20?
We very rarely skip content in our videos.
Yeah,
we skipped Battlegrounds except for the first and last fight.
Yeah, just because we'll show you the enemies here. This is going to be 9 more battles of the exact same thing. We'll be right back.
We'd be reading the phone book.
Yeah.
If we were going through Battlegrounds.
We only have so many things to talk about. We're human.
And so the fact that there was shallow enough experience for us to feel like we could blow through it and just show you the before and after, I really do feel like that is... I don't dislike a lot about this game.
Sure.
I dislike Battlegrounds.
Yeah.
Because if this game is meant to be a teaching tool for players to learn RPGs, teach them things the way that RPGs generally do them, which is zones with enemies and objects available, they will figure it out. Because dungeons are just a more complicated version of that. Yeah. So if they can figure out dungeons... I mean, if you can get through Falls Basin with the pillars you have to push in the right locations and go around and do all that stuff. And to me, that's the big hurdle. Once a player is good enough to get through Falls Basin, if you can figure it out, they're going to get through the rest of this game. If they've managed to play long enough to get this far, and they are clever enough to get through that dungeon, they're good as far as I'm concerned. And so a regular map that you would run around and knock things out is not asking too much of a player, and I think it's a better training tool than a static knock things out. Sure. The one thing I'll say the Battlegrounds probably do better than a static zone is they make it very clear to the player when they've killed enough enemies to move on, aka when they've accumulated enough experience to move on. Yeah. Because having the Battlegrounds gives you a jar with a very set contained amount of experience to hand to a player, so from a theory crafting standpoint, the people putting the game together have a good sense of about how much experience Ben has at any point in the game. Yeah. So you can math the game out a little better.
But I don't like that was included in the curve. Right. For your character's growth. Yeah. I like Battlegrounds. I think there should have been one for each elemental area, and they should not have been included in your expected growth. Right. That's kind of where I'm at with them.
I mentioned it in our playthrough. Having the Rainbow Road be one of those pass-by, walk-through stages with enemies.
Yeah, what's the deal with that?
Would have been amazing. Obviously, it's more stuff to fit on the cartridge, and you only have so much room for sprite work and everything. But the game has a lush number of sprite sets. Like, there's plenty in the tile sets for FFMQ to choose from.
Yeah, I mean the sprite guys. I mean the sprite artists clearly did a lot of work. There were characters that didn't even matter that had unique sprites,
and it's good stuff.
Yeah, I mean look at Otto. You talk to him twice throughout the game. He has a unique sprite. Spencer has a unique sprite.
Yeah, the non-Sid.
Right. Ruben's dad had a unique sprite. His mom not so much.
Yeah, what's the deal with Otto and not Sid?
I don't know. I mean it's like I said, it's a Final Fantasy by another name.
Yeah, that's true. It's we keep thinking of this as if it's going to have Final Fantasy conventions, and it does have a chocobo.
We ought to have gotten Sid for this game,
Right. It's Windia has the chocobo.
Yes.
Yeah.
What? A chocobo?
And that's it. But yeah, it's a reference.
Yeah.
But it does follow a lot of its own kind of beat of its own drum. So, kind of circling back to the expectations. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest is very clearly labeled on the back of the box as an entry-level game.
Sure.
It is, in the instruction manual, it says this. In the, the way the game was promoted, there were promotional materials that very clearly stated that this game was going to show you how to play an RPG.
Yeah. It was plastered in bright, shiny golden letters everywhere for everyone to see that it was not going to be a difficult game.
But I don't think, and I have a hunch you're going to agree with me on this, I don't think saying you're an entry-level game impugns you from criticism where the game still falls short.
Absolutely not. I mean, you have to change your expectation of it, definitely, but it doesn't mean you have to ignore the faults it has. I mean, like with anything, if you do something poorly, I mean, I still have the right to say, okay, well, that could have been better.
Right.
You have the right not to listen, but I have the right to say it.
Yeah, of course. But I think it changes what you criticize, like which parts of that become the talking point. So if you're looking at Final Fantasy Mystic Quest as if it is supposed to satisfy RPG fans,
sure,
then
you wouldn't look at the game and say, "Well, it wasn't hard enough. I don't like it."
It's not hard enough. It's not interesting enough. It's not deep enough. The equipment system is too mundane. This, that, the other. There's a laundry list of things you complain about. When it becomes an entry level game, those complaints change. It's the Battlegrounds system might turn off players because it's too boring, or that you don't have a good enough explanation about what you do with like the crests, or the problem with the characters, like the second characters, icons and sets, and the bugs there, like not lining up well, will confuse players. Like, why does my person keep getting stone on them? It says here they're immune to stone.
Yeah,
stuff like that. So it has faults, but I think they're different faults, and I don't think they are nearly as egregious fault-wise. Like, if you view FFMQ as an entry-level game, the faults it has are bad, but not enough for me to discourage somebody from playing this game.
Sure. And I think that's actually something that a lot of people kind of overlook or ignore entirely, is that the criticisms people have for this game are those things that you really can't have for an entry-level RPG. A lot of people are just like, well, it's just too simple, it's too silly, it's too,
Nobody would look at the putt-putt games and say that the writing is not deep and engrossing enough for my refined palate.
Sure.
Because
you go into this, you bought a bag of Doritos. Don't complain that it didn't fulfill you.
Yeah. It's empty calories, but it's delicious.
Yeah.
There are things to enjoy if you are a veteran fan of RPGs. It doesn't take too long to get through.
Yeah.
It has fun and funny moments. We died laughing at Phoebe's complete inability to hold on to hope for more than 5 seconds.
I love it.
There were moments like walking down Spencer's place where just the music and the waterfalls and everything just kicks that retro aesthetic into high gear.
Yeah.
The music is absolutely awesome.
I love the silly dialogue. Nah, it's Pazuzu.
Yeah, I mean, it's irreverent almost. It's not trying to be, but it is. And so, in a lot of ways, it is a charming game that if you are a veteran RPG player, you can take some fun out of. And even if you're not getting a lot of enjoyment out of, it's not a hard game to knock out of your backlog because you can knock this thing out in hours.
Sure. I mean, we did it in, 9-10 hours?
If that. And we're enjoying the dialogue and
Yeah,
plunking along
we're
and
just,
goofing off and
jerking around,
Sure.
whatever. It's like, I think with that one time when I was just by myself, not really paying attention to dialogue, just playing it, I think I cleared it in like 7 hours, 6 hours. And
So-
the speed run for the game is down to like 2.5.
So this one is not hard to knock out of your backlog if you haven't played it. So
all right, just take a Saturday, get it over with.
Yeah.
And,
but
enjoy it, but get it over with.
more importantly, for the alternate case, for the people who are not RPG people, if you know you're not a fan of RPGs, this game is not going to convert you.
This book is not for you.
But if you don't know, if you're not sure if the genre is for you and you're not really a well-versed RPG player.
If you've just never given it an honest try, or or have been completely unexposed to the idea of them,
I would never give Final Fantasy Tactics
oh hell no,
to somebody who's never played an RPG before.
No.
Because you're going to scare them away with numbers.
Yeah.
This game is perfect for checking to see if the basic core mechanics of JRPGs, going around from place to place, solving people's problems, picking fight magic item, those real basic elements. If you get enjoyment out of that and an unfolding storyline while that is happening, we've checked off that box and we can move on, and now here's all these other experiences.
Yeah, here's Mario RPG or
Right.
Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy IV.
Sure. But
you can work up to Terra Enigma and Secret of Mana,
yeah, and this is, we talked about this in game literacy. It's like, if you're developing a reading list for somebody, you don't give them War and Peace first, you give them Hop on Pop.
Sure.
If you are developing a music literacy thing, you start people out with simple music and then you get into like the Crazy Rich Prog, whatever.
Yeah.
It's really no different for games. If you want somebody to develop an appreciation for RPGs, you can't start them out with the single most complicated RPG you can get your hands on. You want to start them out with something that is bite-sized and digestible and helps them understand and learn RPG elements. And there aren't many games like that in the genre. Mystic Quest is one of them.
Yeah. I do have a hard time thinking of other like very, very basic
Final
RPGs,
Fantasy II Easy Type, as it's kind of referred to, like the US version,
Yeah.
isn't bad. It's a little long.
Actually, maybe it's just because of the way I end up playing the game. I find that the easy version of Final Fantasy II harder. Just because.
Than this? Yeah.
Well, I mean harder than the original difficulty one because of some of the items they took out, like some of the equipment that they removed from the game. Like I rely on that stuff in my current playthroughs.
Well, I'll say I beat that game when I was...
I beat it when I was like 9 or 10.
7, I think.
At the age that I should have been able to beat it when I played it.
So FF2 is one of those ones that you can get through, for sure.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, not a difficult game, but like I play that and then I look at my later playthroughs of the current versions, I'm just like, well, that was a lot easier.
But it is a lot longer, and I will say that it took me some diligence at that age to get through it, because I had Super Mario World and F-Zero also, and it was very easy for those games, bright, flashy, immediately entertaining games, to take my eye off of Final Fantasy.
F-Zero was so good.
Oh, it was amazing. And it wasn't until I was willing to sit down and really start fighting Final Fantasy II that I was able to start getting through it. Mystic Quest, I had no such barrier. When I got Mystic Quest, I guess it was 2 years after, it was 93.
Mm-hmm.
So when I got Mystic Quest, that was a game that at my age I had the skill and the interest and was able to chew through that game.
Yeah.
And it was a very satisfying experience for a young gamer who wanted an RPG experience. I have no reservations about recommending this game to people who are new to RPGs. And it's like, yeah, start with it. You're going to either love it or hate it, and I'm not going to feel terribly bad about it either way, because at the end of the day, we're going to know whether the genre's for you or not.
I mean, I feel much the same way about recommending it to veterans who haven't played it yet, but I will just give them a disclaimer that it's not going to be a challenge. Just turn your brain off when you play it.
Turn your brain off and your headset up.
Yeah, basically.
Woo!
Can that be the tagline for our entire playthrough of this?
I mean...
brains off, sound up!
It's true. It is a rockin' game.
Trying not to like the soundtrack? It's hopeless.
So anything else you can think of before we close out here?
No, just a general, end of thing here. Anytime you guys have any questions or you want to engage in a conversation about this, we're happy to. We both love this game. It's possible that we're biased, but we try our damnedest not to be, and we think we know what we're talking about. So just play the game. Just plug it in and have a good old time.
And if you don't have access to it, watch the episodes. You can get a full idea of what the game's like. It's the point of us doing that anyway,
we fought just about every monster except for you. I think you gave up halfway through the wind tower. I was like, I'm not doing this anymore.
We were leveled up enough. I'm like, yeah, he'll be fine in Doom Castle,
And I was.
Yeah.
And I was. All right. Well, I think that'll wrap it up for us here. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for I'd say watching, but listening really.
Yep.
Enjoy the floating boxes in the background, and we'll see you for the next review.
Game on.